The HOA ordered this family to repaint their house, claiming violations. Fines and inspections loomed, but a clever, shocking act of revenge transformed their home, stunned the neighborhood, and turned the HOA's strict rules completely upside down. It started on a quiet Sunday morning, the kind of morning when sunlight spills over perfectly trimmed lawns and the distant sound of sprinklers fills the air. The neighborhood of Brookstone Meadows looked like a picture out of a real estate brochure. Identical houses, identical mailboxes, identical smiles. Everything was polished, neat, and unervingly controlled. The Anderson family's home stood right in the middle of it all, simple, modest, but full of life. Their kids played in the yard, their dog chased after balls, and their house, painted a soft shade of sky blue, always stood out as cheerful in a sea of beige and gray. It was that touch of individuality that the HOA despised. One morning, as Mark Anderson opened the door to grab the newspaper, he noticed an envelope taped to the door. The HOA's letterhead stared back at him in bold, lifeless font. The message inside was short, sharp, and impersonal. A violation notice citing noncompliance with community color standards. The letter demanded that the Andersons repaint their home within 14 days or face escalating fines. The tone was cold, almost mocking, as if written by someone who found joy in control. At first, Mark thought it was a mistake. After all, he'd chosen that shade from a list of pre-approved colors when they bought the house years ago. But when he called the HOA office, the response was swift and dismissive. The color code has been updated. You're in violation. There was no apology, no conversation, only rules. That evening, the neighborhood buzzed quietly. Neighbors glanced at the Anderson house with that familiar blend of curiosity and judgment. Suddenly became the center of unwanted attention. A sharp-tongued woman named riding their bikes near it. Made her usual HOA's patrol car slowed down every time it passed by, pretending not to look while inspecting had turned into a target. Days turned into a week, and the letters kept coming, each one sterner than the last. The HOA began adding daily fines, citing failure to comply. Their threats became personal, mentioning potential legal action and community harmony concerns. Inside, frustration boiled over. Mark worked double shifts to support his family. His wife, Claire, managed the kids and the home while juggling her online job. They didn't have thousands of dollars to waste repainting their house for a rule that changed overnight. Still, the HOA didn't care. Control mattered more than compassion. By the 10th day, Linda Graves made an unannounced inspection. She walked around their property, jotting notes, snapping photos, and leaving behind another notice. A final warning. The tone of this one was almost gleeful, as if she couldn't wait to find them again. Mark read it under the porch light, his hands shaking with anger. For years, they'd followed every rule, paid every fee, and attended every boring HOA meeting. They had done everything right, but now their loyalty meant nothing. That night, Mark sat on the porch staring at his house, the place he'd built memories in, the walls that held his family's laughter. It wasn't just paint, it was home, and now that home had become a battlefield. Claire joined him silently, sensing the storm in his thoughts. No words were exchanged, they didn't need to be. Something shifted between them that night. The quiet family who always stayed out of HOA drama had reached their breaking point. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Mark already knew what he had to do. He wasn't going to just repaint the house. He was going to make a statement, one the HOA would never forget. The next morning arrived with a chill in the air. Not from the weather, but from tension that hung over the Anderson house like a storm cloud. The latest HOA letter sat unopened on the kitchen counter, its bold header a silent reminder of control. But Mark didn't bother reading it this time. He already knew what it said. Instead, he spent the early hours online, scrolling through forums, searching for the perfect idea. The words creative protest appeared more than once, and each time, a slow grin spread across his face. Claire watched him from across the table, the kind of look that carried both worry and trust. She didn't ask questions. She just knew he was done being silent. By noon, he had a plan, simple, legal, but unforgettable. If the HOA wanted a new color, they were going to get it. But it wouldn't be the dull beige or gray the board loved so much. No, this would be something they could never erase from memory. That afternoon, Mark visited the local paint supply store. The clerk raised an eyebrow when Mark requested 10 gallons of bright, flaming red, the kind of red that screamed from a distance. It was bold, defiant, and completely outside the HOA's color code. But Mark didn't care anymore. He also bought paint rollers, tape, and enough supplies to cover every inch of the house. As he loaded everything into the truck, he caught his reflection in the window. Tired eyes, yes, but also a fire that hadn't been there before. Back home, the neighborhood hummed quietly as usual. Sprinklers turned, cars rolled by slowly, and neighbors peeked from behind curtains, pretending not to notice. The Anderson driveway became a war zone of buckets, brushes, and plastic sheeting. Claire joined in, tying her hair back and helping him tape the edges of windows. The kids laughed as they watched, unaware of the rebellion taking shape. As the first stroke of red hit the wall, it felt like freedom. The soft blue walls, once the HOA's symbol of disobedience, were swallowed by waves of brilliant red. The color blazed under the sun, vivid and unapologetic. With every stroke, Mark's anger melted into satisfaction. By evening, the house looked nothing like the others. It stood out like a flame in a field of ash-gray conformity. People slowed their cars as they passed. Some stopped altogether. Cell phones came out. Photos were taken. The next morning, those photos were online, shared across community pages, Facebook groups, and even a few local news threads. The red house in Brookstone. The headlines read. Some laughed, some cheered, others called it an act of defiance. But the HOA didn't laugh. By the third day, Mark received another envelope, this one hand-delivered by Linda Graves herself. Her tight smile couldn't hide her fury. Though Mark never opened it in front of her, he didn't have to. He could feel her anger in the way she stood there, clipboard trembling slightly in her hand. Inside the sealed envelope was a fine. $500 a day until the house was returned to acceptable standards. But by then, it didn't matter. The photos had already gone viral. Local news stations arrived later that week. Neighbors watched from porches as cameras rolled, capturing the now famous red house and the family that had dared to defy the HOA. Mark stood calmly on his driveway, his arms folded as he gave a short, polite interview. He didn't insult anyone, didn't rant, didn't curse. He simply said, "It's just paint, and I like it this way." That line became the headline. Within hours, the story spread beyond Brookstone. People across the country commented, sharing their own HOA horror stories, their frustrations, their support. Mark became a quiet symbol of resistance against overreaching neighborhood boards. But behind the attention, a darker current began to form. The HOA's leadership met in secret, furious that their control had been challenged so publicly. Linda Graves, now facing questions from both residents and higher officials, was determined to make an example of the Andersons. Late that night, another letter appeared in the Andersons' mailbox. This one marked, "Final Notice." The HOA was moving forward with legal enforcement. The quiet victory of Defiance was over. The real war had begun. The morning the legal notice arrived, the air felt heavier than usual. Clouds hung low over Brookstone Meadows, as if even the sky disapproved of what was happening. The once cheerful Anderson home, now blazing red against the dull row of beige houses, looked both defiant and isolated. A bright flame surrounded by cold stone. The envelope was thicker this time, stamped with official language and too many signatures. Inside were printed pages filled with legal jargon, accusations, and a demand for immediate compliance. The HOA was seeking a court order to enforce repainting. It wasn't just a fine anymore. It was personal. For Linda Graves, it was about power. She couldn't stand the way Mark had embarrassed the HOA. Every day, she passed that red house on her morning walk, her jaw tightening as she watched neighbors slow down to take pictures. Some even waved at the Andersons now. People who used to avoid eye contact suddenly treated them like local heroes. That shift in control infuriated her. In the following weeks, the HOA went into overdrive. They flooded Mark's mailbox with letters, citations for trash cans, grass height, fence maintenance, and even unsightly paint equipment stored in the yard. Every small rule became ammunition. It was harassment disguised as procedure. Mark and Claire endured it quietly at first. They knew reacting would only give Linda more power. But when the HOA began contacting their mortgage lender, claiming community violation affecting property value, the line was crossed. The Andersons were no longer fighting for pride. They were fighting for their home. Then came the court summons. It was set for a Tuesday morning at the local courthouse. The HOA expected Mark to crumble under the weight of bureaucracy. They believed he couldn't afford a lawyer or the time to fight. But they underestimated him. Mark had already reached out to a friend, an attorney who happened to specialize in property and HOA disputes. He'd also collected every letter, every notice, every fine, and every updated color code regulation since they moved in. Each piece of paper told a story, one of manipulation, inconsistency, and abuse of power. On the day of the hearing, the courtroom was half filled with curious residents. Word had spread quickly through the neighborhood app. Even those who had once sided with the HOA came to see what would happen next. Linda Graves sat at the front, confident and composed, flanked by two board members. Mark sat quietly beside his lawyer, calm but alert, his expression unreadable. When the judge entered, silence filled the room. The HOA's attorney began first, presenting their argument. Violation of updated community color standards, refusal to comply, ongoing nonconformity affecting community value. The words came out sharp and mechanical, like a script rehearsed too many times. Then it was Mark's turn. His lawyer stood and, without raising his voice, began unfolding the truth piece by piece. He presented the original HOA guidelines, which clearly listed Mark's chosen blue as approved. He then presented the new rules, updated only a month before the first violation notice was issued, with no resident vote or notification, which was a violation of their own bylaws. Every photo, every date-stamped letter, every unexplained fee. It all formed a pattern the judge couldn't ignore. By the time Mark's attorney finished, Linda's expression had changed from confidence to panic. The courtroom whispered quietly. Then the judge spoke. His tone was calm but firm. He ruled that the HOA had acted improperly by enforcing new regulations without proper notice and had engaged in targeted harassment. All fines were dismissed. The HOA was ordered to cover the Andersons' legal fees. Mark sat still for a moment, processing the words, before a quiet relief washed over him. The news spread through Brookstone Meadows like wildfire. By the evening, the Red House victory was trending on local forums again. Neighbors stopped by with congratulations. Some even shared their own frustrations with the HOA, stories they had been too afraid to tell before. But while most celebrated, Linda Graves sat alone in her office that night, staring at the HOA's crest on her desk. Her empire of control had cracked. The board members who once praised her now questioned her leadership. The emails from residents poured in, complaints, demands for transparency, and a few subtle hints that it might be time for her to step down. For the first time, she realized she wasn't feared anymore. The Andersons' victory wasn't just a personal one. It had shifted the power in the neighborhood. But as Mark stood outside that evening, watching the sunset bounce off the red paint, he had no idea that this battle wasn't quite over, because Linda Graves wasn't finished yet, and her next move would be the most desperate of all. For a few weeks, peace returned to Brookstone Meadows. The red house stood proudly at the end of Maple Lane, glowing brighter under the afternoon sun. Kids played outside again, neighbors waved, and for the first time in years, the community felt alive. But peace never lasts long where power once ruled. Linda Graves was silent, but she hadn't disappeared. Behind closed doors, she was plotting, quietly gathering the remnants of her influence, whispering into the ears of those still loyal to her. She couldn't stand the idea that one family had made a mockery of her authority. The HOA might have lost the legal battle, but she wasn't ready to lose her crown. One chilly morning, Claire Anderson noticed something odd. A large white notice nailed to their mailbox. It wasn't from the HOA this time, but from the City Code Enforcement Office. It claimed the red paint violated a municipal brightness standard. Mark laughed when he first read it. Brightness standard? That's not even a thing. But when he called the city office, the laughter faded. Someone had filed multiple complaints about reflected glare, community disruption, even driver distraction. The name wasn't listed, but Mark didn't need it to be. He knew exactly who was behind it. That evening, he stood in his driveway, looking at the red walls glowing under the streetlight. He took a deep breath and turned to Claire. "I'm not repainting it," he said quietly. Claire nodded. "Then we fight again." Days passed. The story made local news. Family's viral paint job faces city scrutiny. Reporters showed up outside their home. Neighbors gave interviews, and suddenly, everyone had an opinion. Some residents called the paint color bold and unique. Others called it an eyesore. The HOA board tried to distance themselves, pretending they had nothing to do with the new complaints. But people weren't fooled, not after what had already happened. Then, one afternoon, a young reporter approached Mark. She said, "I heard you have evidence that these city complaints came from someone specific." Mark smiled faintly. "Maybe I do." He handed her a folder, copies of anonymous complaint forms with identical handwriting, and a timeline showing the complaints were filed minutes after HOA emails were sent from Linda's account. 2 days later, the evening news aired the headline, "HOA president linked to harassment campaign against local family." That single sentence ended Linda Graves' reign. The next morning, she resigned, not voluntarily, but under pressure from the board and residents who had finally seen the truth. Some even demanded she repay the HOA for the legal costs they'd caused. The red house, once a symbol of rebellion, became something else, a landmark of freedom. People drove by just to take pictures. Some homeowners even started painting their front doors red, calling it the Anderson effect. A month later, Mark stood outside, watching his kids draw on the sidewalk with chalk. Claire handed him a cup of coffee and smiled. "Can you believe all this started over paint?" she said. He laughed softly. "Guess we just had to remind them. This is our home, not theirs." He took out a small brush and dipped it into a can of white paint. On the corner of the garage wall, he carefully painted a small message in neat letters. "Freedom lives here." Neighbors passing by smiled when they saw it. Some honked in support. Others stopped to talk. The tension that had once divided the community was replaced by laughter, shared stories, and a strange sense of unity born from chaos. The HOA, now under new leadership, changed its rules, this time with actual community votes. Fines became rare, and meetings turned transparent. Brookstone Meadows wasn't perfect, but it was finally fair. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Mark sat on his porch scrolling through his phone. His story had gone viral again. News outlets, social media, and even homeownership forums were sharing the saga of the red house that won. He smiled and looked at Claire. "Think it's over now?" he asked. Claire grinned, sipping her coffee. "With HOAs? It's never over." They both laughed. The kind of laugh that comes from exhaustion, relief, and a touch of defiance. Behind them, the red house shimmered softly in the fading light. Not just a home anymore, but a reminder that sometimes, standing your ground, even with something as simple as a paintbrush, can change everything.